Hello, today is Tuesday, January 10th, 2023. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Laura McDonald, a senior partner at LB3, and Laura and I are going to talk about the hidden terms that most telecom contracts have. Now, I don't know if the terms are really hidden or if many enterprises just overlook them or don't understand the potential implications of them. That is because these terms reside in vendor online terms, and those apply to most deals. These are often referred to as service guides or service publications, and some vendors use other benign terms. So, Laura, first, Happy New Year, and thanks for helping kick off 2023.
Thanks, Joe, and Happy New Year to you. I hope everything's off to a good start and our discussion gives folks something to think about in the new year.
All right. So those online terms that I mentioned, the service guide, for example, it sounds like a good thing that would help a customer navigate their contract or telecom service and certainly wouldn't trigger a review or concern. But I think you are going to tell us that they should, right?
You're right, and you're right on both points. They're both good and bad. The vendor online terms, aka service guides for our discussion today, are both a gift, but they're also a little bit more like a Trojan horse. Think about somebody giving your 6-year-old a drum set or a glitter set for the holidays. In principle, it sounds like a great thing, but at 6 a.m. or as you're cleaning up glitter for months, it's maybe not such a great gift. So we could talk a little bit about how that impacts enterprise customers. There are good things about the service guides if you plan ahead and are thoughtful. They can actually have value. For example, you can use them to do a comparison of the vendors before you purchase things, what their products are, what their baseline terms are, and you can determine what you might need to ask for an RFP based on what you see online. There are also some list rates you can look at. Again, list rates are a little bit like, the sticker price of a used car, but they give you at least a high watermark of what you should be prepared for when you're looking at a deal or how a vendor structures its pricing. And there are helpful descriptions and some SLAs you can review. For example, Verizon actually has some SLAs that give some tracking of what their network performance is. So there are valuable things in the online terms. But many enterprises are unaware or blissfully ignorant of what is in the service guides overall and how they apply. And this is where the bad stuff comes in. Service guides are chock full of terms, including terms that can be harmful to enterprises and that can impact things like adding extra charges, early termination fees, auto renewals, liability and limits thereof. There can be disclaimers of service quality, what rights you have to use it, what your warranties are or aren't. There are even obligations on customers to buy certain things or require that your affiliates buy certain things for some vendors and some products. So it's important stuff. And it's issues that you generally would never agree to in a contract without pretty careful review by risk management, business, and legal that often get overlooked because they're just found in a URL. They're not in the 5 to 15 page contract that you get emailed.
All right. This is going to be fun. Carry on.
It's always fun, Joe. Before we dive in, let's start with a little bit of the basics, history, some terminology so we understand how we got here. For many decades as a consumer protection vehicle, carriers had to file what was called tariffs that set out the terms and rates under which they would make their telecom services available to customers. These had to be just and reasonable. They couldn't discriminate. That is, they couldn't give a sweetheart deal to one customer and not to another. And they had to be filed with the regulator, either the FCC or the state equivalent. However, over time, a couple of key things happened. First, the carriers still found ways, lawfully, to distinguish between deals, so some people got better deals than others. The carriers also used tariffs to create and enforce unfavorable terms, and these actually trumped your signed contract, so they were not good for customers. And because of this and some litigation and pressure, frankly, by enterprise groups, the FCC de-tariffed most, not all, but most of telecommunication services. And after many years, states have also relaxed many of their tariffing requirements. As an ancillary, the FCC said, yeah, there are good things about those tariffs. So we're going to require carriers to post information online about their tariff services. And that's how we got to the current service guide environment.
So, you know what, Laura? I've been around long enough that I remember what it was like when telecom services did have tariffs. And in those days, technical innovation was pretty sparse compared to today, and prices were actually quite high. So, generally, I believe deregulation and detariffing has been a very good thing for the ICT industry.
Joe, I couldn't agree more. And de-tariffing has been good, and more competition has led to good things and lower prices for enterprises.
All right, so back to these online terms. Do all carriers use online service guides and do they apply to everything?
Well, pretty much all the carriers have service guides, and they're called all kinds of things, I'm sure, and not so nice names, but they all have them, and they've expanded beyond just your typical telecom services. And some, not surprisingly, are better than others and easier to find and navigate than others.
So, how do you know if they apply?
Uh, First of all, assume they apply. But the best way to identify them is to, first of all, look for a link in your contracts that they send you or what you have. Search for www or look for a URL. Also, keep an eye out for them in the order form. Sometimes they'll be in the 6-point type that's at the bottom that nobody reads. You can also do online searches for the guides and you can find them that way. If you look at the carriers themselves, Verizon and AT&T are pretty easy to find, and there may only be one line in their contracts, but they're there. Both are structured so that they have general terms, kind of like MSA type terms, and then they're divided by product. AT&Ts tend to be very lengthy. For example, their access service guide is well over 200 pages. Some of that's pricing, but it's very lengthy. Verizon's tend to be shorter, but they have a bunch of internal sublinks, so you have to keep linking, and they distinguish between what they call optimized and non-optimized services. Lumen's, on the other hand, is much more difficult to navigate. Fine, in part because they've grown so much by acquisition and they brought in, level 3 that really didn't use service guides. Comcast is a little bit easier to find and it's set up more like AT&T and Verizon, but the terms in there might surprise you and you should look at them.
And the wireless carriers also have these guides.
Absolutely, you bet. On the wireless side, there are also service guides. They're also tricky to find. They're not necessarily with the wireline ones, so you need to look for that. And then AT&T has something that it calls sales information, which includes brochures and other rates, terms, and conditions that aren't in your contract and aren't in the service guide. So you need to watch for those as well.
So, Laura, can an enterprise just say these online terms don't apply?
That's not impossible, but it's difficult. Some carriers will essentially let you copy the terms, negotiate them, and make them part of your contract. But that requires a lot of leverage. If you don't have that type of leverage, really the best approach is multifold. One is you need to make sure they're clearly identified and identified by product. So if you are buying a specific product, you have a link to that product terms so that you know what they are. You have to read them. It's no fun, but it's really important. You need to make sure your contractual terms trump. So anything you've negotiated trumps the online terms, and that you've looked and you've addressed any bad things or things that are missing from the service guide. You also have to address changes, bad things that they add in the future, which is complicated, but there are ways to do that. Third, you need to make a plan for monitoring changes, and you need to download the service guide when you're negotiating and at the close of the deal, because those are your contractual terms. And then, as I mentioned, they do change. And so you have to address what happens when they change.
Okay, so there it is. The online guide changes. That's one of the real issues here, right? The vendors get to unilaterally make changes, and then those changes apply to everyone.
Exactly. I haven't done a scientific study, but I would say that the vendors change their guides maybe once or twice a month. Some of those are innocuous. They're changing typos or adding a product, but some of them are significant ones that impact your deal. For example, Verizon recently added an economic surcharge for its wireless deals to offset inflation cost. And it changed its wireline terms to have certain services, including Ethernet access, subject to auto renewal provision. So, unless the customer notifies Verizon at least 30 days prior to the expiration of the applicable service commitment period, the period renews for 1 year. And if you decide you don't want to auto renew, the rates can increase by 10%. Now, this only applies to a subset. It applies to deals with no revenue commitments, at least for now, but it's an example of a change. And to be fair, on the flip side, AT&T recently announced that it was increasing a number of its surcharges. So effective January 1st, if you compare to what they were in September, AT&T increased property tax allotment from 5.3% to 6.32, increased its federal regulatory fee from 6.38 to 7.92, and increased its administrative expense fee from 1.36 to 1.71.
So, Laura, what can a customer do?
So the remedies vary. And they vary again on your leverage, but they vary from like the very best is just saying no changes, no bad changes apply, to what is probably more common in negotiated deals, which is the customer actually has to keep track of the changes. The customer has the obligation to notify the vendor within a short period of time and threaten to walk if amendments are not made for material and adverse changes. So that's kind of on the bottom end of a remedy. And then there's some room in the middle to come up with solutions for the customer.
These online guides really can cause trouble. I've negotiated several wireless deals with customers where the TCO looks great, meaning that the financials look really good for the customer. The problem is that those online sales documents that drive the pricing can change over the contract term. And if they do, the price is not going to look so hot. And Laura, don't get me started on those economic surcharges that now apply and seem to keep going up.
Joe, I agree. It can be extraordinarily frustrating. But that's why it's important for customers to understand the structure of their deals, to be thoughtful about this, to identify and read the applicable service guides and address as many of these issues as they can up front. You're not going to solve for everything, but it's good to solve for what you can.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you, Laura. If you'd like to learn more about contracting for ICT services, or if you have other ICT needs, you can contact Laura, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or shooting us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to these Staying Connected podcasts, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.